I'm Andrew Seamer from Inventive.io. Today we're going to learn how to automate CSS auto-prefixers so that we can make cross-browser CSS a little bit more easy to work with, specifically using flexbox, which is not terribly cross-browser friendly in all cases. So auto-prefixing in that case is that much more important. Let's take a look. So to begin, we need to create a basic website. So we will create a new file. This new file is going to be index.html. So just a simple HTML file. And the other thing we're going to need is a basic CSS file, since we're focusing on how to auto-prefix CSS. So I will have a styles.css. So using Emmet, we can create our HTML document pretty quickly. Same thing for generating our style sheet. So it sees styles.css already, so that's done. Cool. Next thing we need to do is generate some form of structure that we can apply flex to. So to do that, we can say div with a class type of container, make another div that is an item. But specifically, we want to be able to style each one of these items. So we may say item $, which uses the indexer inside of Emmet. And then we can give it some text inside of each of these items. So we'll say item $, so that will give us the text of item and then whatever that number is. And then let's give ourselves 8 of these items. Using Emmet, if we hit tab, you'll see that we now have a class container, which will be our flexbox container. And then we have a bunch of items, so those will be our flex items. So let's flop over to styles and we'll start knocking out the container. And the container rule, specifically we want to say display flex. What this allows us to do is generate a flex container. So that alone is pretty cool. But if we render it where we're at right now, what we're going to see is not going to be terribly interesting. Let me bring this document over here while we're working on it. And I will shorten this window up. Okay, so as you can see, we've got several div containers. They all have item 1, item 2, etc. That's not necessarily interesting. So let's go ahead and make an item. And the item we will set with a width of 100 pixels and maybe give it a height of 100 pixels. If I could type today. So that alone is pretty cool. If we go ahead and refresh this guy, cool. Now we actually have something to look at. Let's give our container a border. We will make this 2 pixels, solid, and black. And then let's make our items also have a border, 2 pixels, solid, and red. All right. And if we refresh this, what we're going to see is that we now have a flex container. So if we start to squish this guy, let's see what happens. So it's actually treating these flex items. It's not necessarily honoring their width as we start to squish, because flex is going to do its best to fit all these items in there, which means it's not always going to be pixel accurate. So let's give each of these items a flex of 1. So let's open up our flexbox cheat sheet. I always just Google it for it, but the CSS Tricks has a great flexbox cheat sheet. As you can see, there's just a whole bunch of different things that you can do with flex items. Specifically, I wanted to look at justify content. You'll notice there's a bunch of things you can do with that. So we'll apply that to our container, justify content, and let's go ahead and center our items. So doing that, now you can actually see that we have centered all of these items. And as we stretch, oh, I'm sorry, let me remove this guy. So we added a flex of 1. Flex of 1 is what you're seeing here. So flex of 1 is trying to fill all these items proportionally. If we remove the flex of 1, then we will go back to honoring our width of 100 pixels. Cool, so you'll see we've got all this big space here. And then if we go back to our justify content center, it's going to move those items inside of our container into the center. So no matter how big we do, This is always going to be centering our items. But since we have some space, we can do something like space around. And as you can see with Flexbox, it's going to do its best to keep the width of each of these items, but then break up the space around the items equally. We can also do space between, and when we have that, all that's going to do is get rid of this end space. So now if I make the window bigger, you'll see that the space between each of these items proportionally is growing and being divided accordingly. So if you haven't played with Flexbox, you definitely want to do that. Just to give props to Wes Boss, if you haven't heard about him, he's got a great Flexbox tutorial. Everything you ever wanted to know about Flexbox, very entertaining. Go to flexbox.io to learn more about that. Do keep in mind CSS tricks, specifically a guide to Flexbox, also very handy. Okay, so we've generated some Flex items, as you can see through here. We'll leave some of these things in here. The next thing that we need to do is understand that Flex is not, or Flexbox is not terribly cross-browser friendly. Some browsers support it really well, some browsers don't. So if we look here, we've got a site called shouldIprefix.com, specifically with intentions around Flexbox. Flexbox has a whole bunch of different prefixes, again, because the spec for Flexbox has been changing over time. So each browser has implemented some variation of Flexbox, which tells me that, yes, we probably should prefix our Flexbox-enabled CSS. So there's this great tool called Autoprefixer. And as an example, just taking the CSS that we've created so far, we can come in here and just simply paste our CSS and make that wider so it's a little easier to look at. So this is the CSS that we wrote for our web page, and this is the generated CSS from the Autoprefixer. You'll notice just the one line of display flex, I have display WebKit box, MS Flexbox, flex, and then for the justify content, I have WebKit box pack justify, MS Flex pack justify, justify content, space between. Either you're going to spend a lot of time memorizing all of these prefixers, and then you're going to bloat your code with all of these prefixes, or you're going to use a tool like Autoprefixer online. But that means every time I go and tweak my CSS, I need to remember to come here, grab my prefixes, store that. Over time, if you keep this code inside of your project, it's going to get large and unwieldy and not very easy to understand. So it's best if we keep the practice of nice, clean, current CSS, much like you would do with JavaScript and transpiling down to an older version. We keep nice, clean CSS, and we generate some other thing as a build artifact. So that's what we're going to learn how to do today, is the local build generation, specifically using Gulp. To start with Gulp, I'm going to go ahead and close our HTML page. We don't necessarily need that anymore. We are going to look inside of, in my case, a Gulp-Autoprefixer start. You'll notice that all I have in here at the moment is my HTML file and my style sheet. So let's get into that project. So I want to change my directory into projects. I believe I put this into a bootcamp folder, and then inside of that, a Gulp-Autoprefixer. Okay, and then if I look in there, let's go into Gulp. Let's use the start folder. Cool. So I am where I need to be. If I look at that, I just have index.html and styles.css. So go ahead and get your project up to this point, and then we'll get started. Okay, so the one prerequisite for this particular project is that you do have to have Node installed. So Gulp is actually running within the Node runtime. We're going to need npm, which is the Node package manager. If you haven't used those before, you can look at those on YouTube or go to some blog posts, but they're pretty well covered. We'll cover them here in the future at inventive.io, but for now, you'll have to look elsewhere for that. So in order to get our project to be Node compliant, what we're going to do is say npm init, and what this is going to do is create our package.json, which Node uses to manage dependencies and who the author is, etc. So npm init is going to create that package JSON for us. It's going to ask you a bunch of questions. In this case, it's not that important that we go through and answer them all, so you can just hit enter, and it's going to assume defaults for all of these variations. You'll notice here on the screen that we have all of the questions that you just answered. This is actually the data that you're going to put into your node, or rather your package JSON. So we hit enter, and inside of our project, you'll notice we now have a package.json. It took all those defaults and dumped them into this file for you. Cool. All right, so the next thing that we need to do is get our dependencies in order. So to do that, all we need to do is an npm install gulp. Gulp, again, is a local build tool. There are a bunch of different build tools that you can use. We're going to use Gulp in this case. So what we want to do is pass a flag of -g. And what this says is I want to globally install Gulp on this computer. That's pretty much all it's doing. Do know that -g is going to go grab the latest version of Gulp and bring in all of its dependencies. So you'll see that these things are being installed, and we'll let that finish out. All right, once we've done that, you'll notice that our package JSON actually hasn't been changed at all. There are no dependencies defined for this particular project. So in order to do project dependencies, we're going to use Node Package Manager and install Gulp. But in this case, we're going to use --save, but specifically with a flag for dev. So the difference here is Gulp is installing them locally in your computer. --save is installing dependencies in your project, but --dev is defining development-only dependencies. So if you look at like a client-side build tool, well, we're not going to really use that in production. We're probably also not going to use the auto-prefixer in production. We're going to generate files that will actually ship to production. So npm install gulp --save -dev. And what this is going to do is update our package JSON with this dev dependency on Gulp. It's also going to install a bunch of node modules that Gulp has a dependency on. So you'll see a long list of a bunch of different node dependencies in here, node packages, that Gulp actually has a dependency on. So if we go into our package, we now have a section called dev dependencies on Gulp, specifically version 3.9.1, which has a dependency on all of these modules. So that's kind of how Node works. We can bring in a bunch of different dependencies and tools and use them when building our application. Cool, good start. The other part that we need is the Gulp-Autoprefixer. So Autoprefixer, the tool that we just looked at, has a Gulp package that we can actually use so that we can automate this. So again, npm node package manager, we're going to install the Gulp-Autoprefixer, and we will do that globally. Let's see, did I do something wrong? Oh, I misspelled install. It is important that you spell things correctly. Okay, so this is just like we did with Gulp. This is going to go grab all the dependencies for the Gulp-Autoprefixer. If we already have some of those dependencies when we install Gulp, it's not going to refetch those again. Using the up arrow on terminal, we can come back in here. Given that it's the same command for npm install Gulp-Autoprefixer, but again, we want to put this into our project. So --save -dev, no reason to retype the whole thing. Might misspell it again. So this is going to add to our package JSON the Gulp-Autoprefixer version 4.0. So now we've got everything ready. We can actually start to create a Gulp file and specify some tasks. So inside of our project, we want to create a new file. Specifically, this file has to be called gulpfile.js. Gulp assumes that you have a Gulp file where all of your tasks are going to be defined. If you choose to name it something else and you try to run a Gulp task, it's going to complain. So to get started, we want to bring in Gulp so that we can work with it. We do that through require. So we're going to make a variable called Gulp equals require and Gulp. Spelling is always important. Same thing with our auto-prefixer. So we can say auto-prefixer equals require Gulp dash auto-prefixer. Okay. All right. So these are the two things that we need to make our first Gulp task. Gulp works on a series of tasks. You can give each of those tasks a name. You can individually run various tasks, or you can make certain tasks call other tasks. So we're going to make the first task that will actually do the auto prefixing for our styles. To do that, we say gulp.task. We give it a name. In this case, we can call it styles. We can call it build styles, whatever you want to do. And because it is JavaScript, specifically its node, we can define a function here and just type out all the things that we want for this particular task. So the first thing that we want to do is gulp.source, which is going to open up a file. Gulp.source is just opening a file to be worked on. Specifically, we want to call our styles.css. And then once we have that file, the way Gulp works is off the concept of piping. So we have all the data that lives inside of our styles.css. We can send that data to the next activity. In this case, we want to call Autoprefixer. And Autoprefixer is going to be passed in all the data that's in our style sheet. And it's going to do all of its auto prefixing magic. And so once we have the auto prefixed CSS, we then want to send that data to the next thing, which is going to be gulp.dest. And all that this is doing is writing the file styles.css to some other location. So we can actually send it to, in this case, a build folder, where it will write out styles.css. You can write it anywhere you like, but obviously styles.css can't coexist with styles.css, so it does need to go somewhere. And once we've done that, we should have an appropriately built gulp task that we can call on the command line and start working with our auto prefixer. So let's jump down here to the command line just to make sure we are inside of the appropriate place. So we can say gulp and then call styles. And when this runs, what you're going to note is we now have a build folder, and inside of the build folder, we now have styles.css. And much like what we saw in the auto prefixing website, we actually have a bunch of different prefixes for flexbox. So that's great. That's definitely better than going over to a web page every time and copy pasting and then saving and so on. But it's still not quite perfect, right? So what we need to do is get to a point where maybe we change this property, which is going to evenly distribute the space. So if we look at our styles output, nowhere in here is it mentioning flex. That's a commented out thing. Come back down to our terminal, run gulp styles. That's going to run its doohickey. And if we go back in here, you'll notice that now the flex of 1 has been auto-prefixed also. So this is leaving us in a position where we have to remember to do this every time, but at least it's automated. It is a task that we can run. The other part of this is when the next person, the next dev on the project, gets this project, he doesn't have to know about the auto-prefixer. He just knows that he needs to run gulp.styles as part of the normal process. Okay, so how can we make this better? To make this better, we need to go into our gulp file. We're going to create a new gulp task, and this gulp task is going to specifically watch the styles.css file. So every time we make a change to it, it will auto-prefix it for us and override the build style sheet. So to do that, we make a new gulp task, so gulp.task. We can call this auto prefix if we like. We can call it auto prefix if we like, or we can call it watch. Specifically, it's going to watch the CSS. So let's call it watch styles. And again, make it a function. And inside the function, we can specify exactly what we expect to do here. So in this case, we're going to say gulp.watch, and we're going to watch styles.css. After we watch it, watching it just says when styles.css changes, let's run another task. You can run more than one task, but in this case, we need to have it call styles. So every time this style sheet changes, call the styles task lines 4 through 8 and run the auto prefixer. And that's all we need. So now we can come down to our command line, run gulp, watch, styles. Now this is going to hang this command line open. We can't really do anything else here. But if we go down to styles, I'm going to make a change. So I'm going to comment this back out. Watch the command line here. I'm going to go ahead and save the file. Bloop. All right, done. So in almost 9 milliseconds, notice that flex has been commented out again. That's pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment this guy out again. Now watch the generated output and this guy. Notice that we now have that back. So now we're fully automated. So every time I make a change to my style sheet, I know with confidence that as long as this watcher is running in my dev environment, it's going to automatically make changes for me. All that is great. However, we're still referencing styles.css. So the one thing that we do need to change is to make sure that we are watching the build styles.css. So in production, we point our HTML to the prefix or the auto prefix style sheet. And other than that, we are ready to go. Okay, so we've got this guy over there. He's referencing all of our auto prefixed CSS. So let me open up our actual styles and let's comment this guy out, and let's remove our justify content and save it. And that just shortened up everything we have here. If I go ahead and refresh that, did exactly what I thought it would do. Let's go back over here and let's change justify content so that instead of space between, let's just do center and save that guy. My auto prefix kicked in. Refresh this guy, who is referring to our build.style sheet. That's the magic. If you have any questions or would like to see me build whatever, please feel free to contact us at hello@inventive.io. We welcome as many different ideas as you might have. If you found this video useful, please share it with your friends and ultimately subscribe to our channel. We're hoping to pump out, a video a day. Cool. Thank you.